The Future Sport Podcast is brought to you by 3Advance, developers of sports tech apps that are AI-powered and UX-focused. So if you're looking to create some apps for your startup or your sports biz calls for some artificial or business intelligence, you should check out 3Advance. They're incredible. Go to 3advance.com. That's the number 3advance.com.
Empire.
Do players really need to manage the load?
He became faster. He became more of a shooting, became more of athletic. If you're not athletic, you can't play, or you're not going to be as used. Back in the days, even if you weren't jumping, it didn't matter. As long as you be able to clog the lane, get for a rebound, that's it.
That's sports scientist Juan Delgado from the New York Sports Science Lab, where there's no controversy over the NBA's PR issue of players who won't play 82 games. This is the Future Sport Podcast. I'm Bram Weinstein. Juan Delgado and one of his colleagues at the New York Sports Science Lab, Sean Kuechenmeister, will join us for a look at why load management actually makes sense for the modern NBA player. Plus, they're going to weigh in on a number of new training techniques for all disciplines where the load always needs to be managed. But first, the future is now with a wearable that can no longer simply be called goggles. Our guest this week is Dan Eisenhardt, who's the founder and CEO of Form, which has created swim goggles that simply and practically are unbelievable. Thanks for joining us, Dan.
Thanks for having me.
What do they do?
So our goggles come with a smart display that shows you metrics in real time while you swim. And that's unprecedented because up until today, you've had to rely either on your gut, your instinct, or maybe a wristwatch, which you can't, of course, look at while you're swimming.
The visibility of it, how did you kind of deal with that technology to be able to see this while you are literally underwater?
So that's the tricky part. So we've used a custom waveguide, as we call it. So we were able to guide the light from our display through a lens and some mirrors and then display it to the wearer in an unobtrusive way that's augmented. So you're seeing whatever we want to show the user, you're seeing that sort of overlaid on reality in the pool, but you're still able to see everything around you. So that is the tricky part of the display, and we come with some experience having done that for other products in other sports with a previous company that I was involved in.
Can you give me some examples? What were the other sports where you were able to use the similar technology?
So the background for this company is actually a company called Recon Instruments, which I founded back in 2008. And that company was founded on the basis of the same idea as Form. It was basically the idea of being able to deliver real-time metrics for swimming. Well, back then, we found out it was not possible to really deliver on that vision, given the sort of the maturity of the technology at the time. So we pivoted, so to speak, very early on into skiing. And then we launched a number of products with a number of eyewear companies such as Oakley and Smith and Scott, where this was sort of a display that you had to glance down at, and then you could see your speed and your altitude, and you could get text messages and so forth. So that experience, we have a lot of the same team members from back then that came over into this company, which has given us that deep expertise, domain expertise, if you will, in AR. I forgot to mention, we actually also managed to launch a product for cycling, which was a smart class called Recon Jet, which was the same principle, just on a pair of sunglasses. But we were purchased by Intel shortly after that.
I got to tell you, if my 10-year-old daughter was answering a text message while going down a black diamond, I'd be a little upset about it.
Yeah, I think the answering part was something you had to stop to get. But often what happens when you're on the ski hill is that you're getting a text and you don't know because your phone is in your pocket.
Yeah.
And then you're supposed to meet somebody, 30 minutes ago. So that was more the notion of getting that information when you needed it And so it's a very practical and also fun and entertaining way to use AR. But I think this product that we have now is obviously, I think the value proposition is sort of night and day because you have nothing yet you require to access your metrics in real time. And swimming is, winning and losing, if you're looking at the competitive segments, is determined by hundredths of a second. And yet you have no access to even just the timing of your intervals, for example, during a practice while you swim.
Since you're bringing up the competition side of this, do you think this will ever be allowed in sanctioned competitions?
I don't think it will, at least not in the near term. In competition, there are very strict rules around what you can even communicate to your swimmer as a coach. You're not allowed to indicate the time during a race. So you're not even able to see any kind of timer during the race. And plus, at the race, once you show up on race day, you've spent 99.9% of your time training in a pool for that day, and you're just focused on going as fast as you can. So there's very little you can do on the day. I think with additional technology, it's almost the opposite. Like that, you have to kind of rely on your training and the fact that you've done proper preparation.
I mean, it's interesting. It might have the unintended consequence if a literal Olympic swimmer was going slower than they thought they were going, how that would affect them. That's really it's amazing if they actually had that information in real time.
Yeah, it would be. I think there is a time for that. You could really dumb it down and give you very simple, specific things where you could sort of say, okay, if you have to hit a certain time, you'd get prompted if you're just, let's say half a second behind that time. I think you're right. That would probably prompt you to go faster for that last bit. But that's also, I guess, part of the charm of the sport there, that you've got a little bit of unknown. You have to sort of rely on the athlete in the moment. So I think that there's something to be said about that as well for race day.
You were a competitive swimmer, right? This is in your background?
Yes, I come from a family of swimmers, actually, all the way back to my grandfather, who won a river crossing back in the 1920s. And then since then, all my uncle, my dad, and my brother, we've been swimmers. So I was not Olympic level, but, swam in Denmark, where I grew up, at a national level, and also swam in the U.S. in college. So I know how it's like to be on a team and train, twice a day, get up at 5:30 in the morning for your 2-hour practice, and I know how lonely an existence it is to be in that pool without anything. You're just looking at the bottom of the pool while you're swimming. It's really inefficient.
So what was the transition for you? How did you end up getting into technology, and specifically for athletes?
Yeah, so this started back there in 2006. I was doing an MBA. So I'm an engineer, a mechanical engineer. That was my background. And then I went and did an MBA in 2005 in Australia, of all places. And there I was offered an exchange program spot in Vancouver, British Columbia. So off I went to British Columbia. I chose entrepreneurship as one of my courses. And the first thing I had to do was get up and pitch an idea that I was passionate about. And I frankly came up with this idea on the same day. I was sort of breaking my mind for ideas, and I couldn't come up with anything. And then I realized, well, what am I passionate about? I'm passionate about swimming, and I have always had this annoyance with lack of real-time information in swimming. So I pitched this idea back in 2006, got a team together, a project together, and that's when, already doing that project on the MBA, we sort of thought, okay, this is probably too difficult to pull off at first, as the first product, the swimming goggles. So we already started looking into skiing goggles. And then we incorporated the company in 2008.
I mean, I can imagine the first couple versions. Was it the visibility? Was that the problem, that it impeded your vision too much to implement it?
Do you know what? At that time in 2006, I guess the iPhone hadn't even come out yet. It was still early days in terms of sensing technology, and low power solutions on electronics. There was still early days. So just looking at the battery you needed and the bulk of the solution, the size of the components, and when you put all that together, we sort of ran the numbers and looked at the size of the goggles, and we're like, this might be getting a little bit too big. And even if we could pull that off, there was still the whole notion of how are we going to actually be able to accurately detect these events in the pool, detect what stroke you're swimming and your splits and your rest automatically when you're sitting on the head. because we knew we couldn't have sensors in water communicate or rely on sensors mounted on the body on the water. So we had to have everything just sitting on the head, and that was a tall order. We didn't really know how to do that. We thought, well, maybe there's another sport that's also big and where we could implement that technology into a larger form factor, a pair of ski goggles that we're already wearing.
So skiing, you're skiing. I'm sure there's different form, but you're skiing. There's different form in a pool. Your goggles know if I'm doing a breaststroke or freestyle, it's aware of this?
It's aware of a lot of things, and that's the first thing you have to be aware of. What stroke type are you actually swimming? So we know that immediately. We know what your stroke rate is, how many strokes you take per load, when you're resting, when you're not resting. So we have all this data to collect, and we have used machine learning. That's how we're able to do it. And this is what we didn't know back in 2006. There was a much more, scarce expertise, and now a lot of people, engineers, are trained in this domain. And we use them to be able to detect patterns between your sensor outputs, so what we're actually detecting on the goggles, and what you're actually doing. You're swimming freestyle. You have a certain way, a certain motion signature, if you will, that's detected and picked up by the sensors. And then a machine learning algorithm can make sense of that and tell the computer what is actually happening. And then once we know what stroke type you're swimming and other metrics, then we can start to then make sense out of that, bring meaning to it, and feed that back to the user.
That's really wild. What can it not do now that you'd like to see it be able to do in a future version of it?
So it's hard for me to speak to future features. I've had bad experience with that in the past because you sort of speculate, and then people think, oh, is that in the current version, or is that coming? So we really don't speak to any features unless they're launched. But what I can say is that we have solved the fundamental problem in swimming with the current version in terms of being able to detect accurately your split times. That's the most important thing. So when you're turning, you get your split for the last length. When you rest, you get your split for the interval, or up until that point, it counts the distance. And now we have a partnership with Polar as well on heart rate, so we can get that real-time heart rate feed in there. So really, the goggles as they are now is plug and play for anybody who is swimming. And for the serious swimmer, like I was back in the day, and even higher level, for the Olympians, this is something that is completely revolutionary for them, because they're now able to actually, those 6 hours they spend in the pool, they're able to use those 6 hours or 4 hours or however many hours they spend much more efficiently. And they can work with their coach as well much more efficiently.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I can see Michael Phelps and of course Lindsey Vonn using your goggles, and it makes a lot of sense. What about the average swimmer? What are they able to do with these? Why would they want them?
Do you know what? That's one of the big surprises that we've seen. Is we wanted to make sure that we set the bar really high in terms of accuracy and what we could actually do with the goggles, so we could get these high-level competitive swimmers on board. Because we thought that was very important for the brand, and that's also my background. But what we've seen very early on is that fundamental feature set that we have, fitness swimmers are actually loving it, because it's kind of gamifying the experience. They're jumping in the pool, they're no longer lost. There's a little bit of structure. You can, you swim a length, and then you can see, oh, I was actually a second faster than my last length. And you stop, you rest. It shows you, the time, of day. That's also important information if you can't see a pool, sort of a clock on the wall there. So there's a lot of practical stuff and gamified stuff that's in the goggles for those swimmers. So we've actually seen really good feedback on that.
Is there any kind of model where this information can then be shared with other swimmers locally, regionally, around the country, around the world, where you can kind of see where you stack up? Or are you guys looking at that model at all?
Yeah, I think that's something that's inevitable for any community, and we have a community now. It's obviously growing fast, and that's I think an important part of the product offering. That you're able to upload the swim. It just happens seamlessly when you save the activity in the goggles there. It connects to your phone, it uploads, and you can share your stats, and you can mark it private or public. If it's public, other people, your friends, followers can go and click on it and look at your metrics. So I think that's that's something that is also really exciting for all swimmers to be able to, on the bus ride home, you're just reviewing what you actually did, and maybe you're making plans for your next swim, or you're sharing it with your friends, bragging about how fast you were. So I think that's something that we see from other sports platforms is driving the stickiness and engagement for users. So we're going to continue to listen to our customers and find out, well, what are the most compelling features that we can now launch to increase that engagement. And then that's what we're in that learning mode right now. So we'll see what we end up implementing, but that's much more iterative and something we're working on every day.
Is there a background in military here with this? It feels like there's an easy application where the military would want to utilize something like this as well.
Yeah, we've seen military applications for augmented reality. Maybe that was even where it all began, with these notorious fighter pilot helmets. And there's all kinds of ethical evaluations about that when you're a tech company and you cater to military.
Yeah.
And we've seen that backlash at Microsoft and other companies. So it's something that if you do decide to do that, you need to make absolutely certain that that's part of your culture as well, as not just being a good business case potentially for your technology. For us, it's not something that we're going to be doing. This is the market for swimming is gigantic. There's over 30 million active pool swimmers in the U.S. alone. In the world, we've seen estimates of over 240 million active pool swimmers. So it's one of the biggest sports in the world, yet there's really very little technology today for that sport. And so the opportunity there in that market is just enormous. And I don't think we'll run out of things to offer those customers in any time in the near future. We're going to be very busy just with that.
How about the industry, though? This is very disruptive for them. It's very different. We're talking about, you had talked about how solitary the experience is when you're training and you're really taking it very seriously. And this is an opportunity to kind of open up a community here by sharing one's data with one another and be part of something. Are they open arms to all of this, all these changes that are happening?
You know what they are? We just came back from the World Clinic, a coach clinic in Dallas. So all these elite coaches from all over the world assembled. I think they do it once a year. This year was in Dallas, and we had a booth there, and I did a little keynote, and we had a chance to really show off the goggles. And we had expected that it was going to be a little bit more convincing because, of course, if you have an industry where there hasn't really been much technology in the past, of course, there's going to be less experience with that and comfort around using technology. But it was almost as if, sort of a eureka moment where coaches were saying, we've been waiting for this for a long time. And actually, we even have a swimmer on our team already, some of the early adopters who went on your site and purchased a pair. And now I need a pair as fast as possible so I can get ahead of them and know what's going on. So we're kind of seeing that attack from both sides, the swimmers, especially younger swimmers, that are just like seeing this as an obvious next step for them. And then the coaches trying to catch up, but definitely seeing the value because it frees up them to focus more on the dialogue with the swimmer to get their technique improved. Whereas today you have, coaches with 3 stopwatches around their necks, and they're just kind of trying to capture people's times, and maybe they'll communicate those times with a third of the swimmers, a third of the time, but nothing gets written down or captured. So every workout is kind of, every time you show up for the next workout, it's a complete reset. And during that time, it's hectic. So I think that it's clear that coaches are going to have a lot more time on their hands to actually value add in terms of technique improvements. So that's why we thought we witnessed this in real time, so to speak, at the conference. The coaches were actually open arms on this.
They are really cool. I just encourage everyone to check them out. They're incredible. Dan Eisenhardt is the founder and the CEO of Form. Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you, Bram.
Up next, Juan Delgado and Sean Kuechenmeister from the New York Sports Science Lab on modern training and why load management makes sense. This is the Future Sport Podcast. Let's check in with one of the modern sports science labs and how the training of top-tier athletes continues to evolve with Juan Delgado and Sean Kuechenmeister from the New York Sports Science Lab. Hi, guys. Thanks for joining us.
Very good. Well.
What's new up in New York these days?
Well, many things. Since the last time we spoke, as you know, we work with a lot of different athletes, especially professional athletes in collegiate, high school. So one of the things that we've been doing is improving our global assessment. What we do here at the lab is very important. And the way that we do it is we do something called global assessment. The global assessment basically is going to be evaluating all different imbalances, situations that they have to fix on. Maybe muscles are not working properly, flexibility, mobility, and also a very important part, which is brain training, see how they take decisions, quick decision making, everything like that. So what we're doing right now, besides improving it in terms of the quality of it and the data that it's giving us, which is right now more than 1,800 points of reference for data, is we're trying to make it, or we're actually working on having an application that is going to be taking machine learning. So what it's going to do is going to be taking all the information from this assessment, all the imbalances that you can have, it's going to be taken into a big database, doing an algorithm is going to be immediately evaluating, giving you what is going on with that athlete, and giving you recommendations based on the assessment findings. So that's one of the biggest things that we've been doing so far. Having an app that has machine learning and also artificial intelligence to identify those imbalances when you put the information, and at the same time give you recommendations is a big step forward.
Can you be specific, Juan, and give us an example of getting these data points and translating it into a new training method to help the athlete get better?
Certainly, that is not a problem. For example, to be a little bit more specific on how this works, let's say you have an athlete who cannot really move, has a little problems on flexing the knee, or knee flexion, a little restricted on the mobility on the hip. So that translates into what we're going to be doing with training. We're going to be working more on flexibility, working more on the range of motion, working more on the muscles that create that range of motion. I always do an analogy saying that our body is like a crane. When the skeleton is the crane itself, and whatever moves the crane, which in regular crane is a cable, will be the muscles. So when we're doing this assessment, it tells me exactly what muscles are working or not, and if they're affecting that mobility, like I mentioned to you, in the knee flexion or the hip rotation, and then you work on those. So the translation to the training itself, it's working on those muscles that need to be strengthened or relaxed when they're too tight, or they're affecting the range of motion. Another example is when you're doing the assessment is to see the quick decision making, for example, seeing how they react to different stimulus when they have to do target-based exercises, for example, how quick they can do it. If they can respond to the stimulus in about 0.6 of a second, and they can't, then we need to work on that to make the brain react to that or retrain the brain. So when we do the assessment, everything that we do is very targeted. And the training per se, it's based on that targeting.
Sean, you're one of the trainers there. Can you take us through how you work with the athletes?
Absolutely. So my big mantra and our big mantra here at the company is that if you're not assessing, you're guessing, and that's really become a big staple point going forward as far as how we handle our philosophy with training or with rehab. Juan's job is to accumulate all of those data points that we were talking about earlier, and once we have all of that data, it really takes a team to sift through and decide what's really most important. What are our micro goals? What are our macro goals? What do we want to focus on as far as our priorities? And obviously, there are circumstances where if we're working with a fighter, oftentimes there's deadlines. If we're with a professional athlete, sometimes, we need to adjust our goals based on whether it's in-season, preseason, or if it's mid-season. So once we have an idea of what it could be, what factors could be potentially making someone more likely to have an injury or potentially leaking performance somewhere, then we're going to go in and we're going to decide exactly what it is that's causing that. So, for example, Juan was using the example of a knee. We see a lot of non-contact ACL injuries. It's one of the most hot-button issues in the industry right now. And one of the most confusing elements, I think, for clinicians when they first start evaluating and assessing joints is someone missing mobility because of an actual tissue restriction, or is it a lack of actual muscle control? So when you utilize technology such as EMGs, surface EMG technology, or 3D motion analysis, we're not only going to have an idea of are you limited in your mobility on one side versus the other, but we're also going to know, is that because of a muscle dysfunction, or is that because the nerves aren't firing evenly on both sides? So when I personally view a joint that is dysfunctional and it is a muscle imbalance situation, that's something that's most likely going to be addressed in a pre-workout activation drill. So for example, if I'm struggling with terminal knee extension, that's something that's going to be addressed by activation drills where we're focusing on those terminal degrees of knee extension. We're going to be doing drills that involve dynamic variable resistance training, maybe with something like bands or with chains. It really comes down to what the ability level of the athlete is as far as their baseline. But activation drills, dynamic warm-ups need to be specific to the training. They need to be specific to the goals. So everything from the warm-up to the actual workout to the cool-down and even to the off-day maintenance program is guided by this global assessment and the results that we get from it.
Through all of this, have you found some traditional methods that were actually detrimental to the success of an athlete?
Absolutely. What we saw and what we're still seeing a little bit of now is that kind of in the 80s, the bodybuilding industry kind of hijacked the sports performance industry, and you see a lot of it manifesting in the college and in the high school setting where strength and conditioning coaches or even just typical coaches are promoting a lot of joint isolation training. So the dominant thought process was, okay, I need to work on my speed, so I'm going to isolate my hamstrings, I'm going to isolate my quads, I'm going to isolate my glutes. But in reality, the human body is an interconnected system of muscles and nerves, joints, ligaments, and if we're not training the body in not only that systems approach, but also in a three-dimensional approach, then we're not really going to be preparing the body for the demands of sport. So in biomechanics, we're taught that we have three dimensions of movement. We've got the sagittal plane in front and behind us. We've got the frontal plane side to side, and we've got the transverse plane where we're rotating. And when you look at a lot of these traditional strength and conditioning models, you see a lot of squatting, you see forward and reverse lunging, you see deadlifting, pushing and pressing, and the issue is most of those movements are very sagittal plane dominant. And then when you compare that to where most of these non-contact injuries are happening, you're seeing it's mostly frontal and transverse plane. So not to say that the bodybuilding industry or the powerlifting industry is inherently flawed or wrong, but if we're training an athlete, we need to first train the person. We need to build that general physical preparedness by that three-dimensional movement approach, by that interconnected system approach. And then we really need to see through an evaluative lens which plane of motion are you most limited in, because your power and your ability to perform is going to be not only movement and activity specific, but also plane specific too. So I've taken a real step back in my programming and made a conscious effort to incorporate all three planes of motion in every training session, and especially in terms of fighters, baseball players, tennis players, golfers, anyone that has to really rotate explosively, bowlers too for sure, anyone that has to rotate and anyone that has to really move from one plane to the other seamlessly, we need to really focus our training not so much on our Olympic weightlifting movements, but also really owning those three planes of motion. So if I could say there was one real detrimental thought process with strength and conditioning, it was that we became very single joint dominant for a long time, and then we became very single movement plane dominant for a long time. And I've noticed a really positive trend across the industry, especially in the past 5 to 10 years, that people are kind of moving out of that dynamic and getting a little bit more three-dimensional.
You bring all this stuff up, and I can't help but think back to the mantra of bigger, stronger, faster. And it goes back to this idea that this is what the athlete was supposed to look like. But what you're saying is that may never have been true.
Sure.
Definitely.
And, there is a place, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to powerlifting and traditional bodybuilding. Bodybuilders are actually some of the least frequent injured athletes on the planet, and it's because that method is safe. So I think there is a time and a place for single joint isolation training, and there definitely is a time and a place to really focus on developing power and building up those Olympic weightlifting movements for certain sports and certain positions. But overall, if our main focus is on the training and not on building the athlete himself or herself, or building the specific movement qualities that are pertinent to the sport, then we're really doing them a disservice. So bigger, stronger, faster, it's all great, but if your movement is flawed, or if you're big, strong, and fast only in one plane of motion, then you are incomplete, and there are going to be imbalances that will come up one way or another. It may not come up in the gym, but if we're going through the rigors of a long season and there's stress and there's fatigue and there's the inevitable aches and pains, something's going to give at some point. And we like to think that, the injury prevention is really a matter of injury mitigation. We need to look at all the factors that could potentially lead you to having non-contact or overuse injuries, and really just working on building you up three-dimensionally and learning how to stabilize, learning how to mobilize, and do it in a way that is consistent and it's time appropriate.
And adding to that, nowadays you see guys like defensive tackles, for example, they're 320 pounds, 340 pounds, that they move extremely fast. They move as fast as a running back. 10 years ago, we don't have that. We didn't have that. So our physiology, our bodies are changing, and they're evolving to be faster and stronger. So our methodologies and our ways of thinking for training and for assessing a person or an athlete should go evolving as well. So more than having the bigger, stronger, faster mantra right now should be bigger, smart, be stronger, smart, and be faster, smart. Doing it the right way now.
It's interesting you bringing that up because it involves strategy, and it used to be that NFL teams employed very large people to occupy space to stop running backs, but these days the linemen are lighter and faster mainly because of the team's desire to throw the ball more.
So if we don't evolve with that, and that's one of the things that the assessment has been able to help us in that matter, is because we don't, just like Sean is mentioning, we don't just look at an athlete from one point of view, one plane. We actually look for the whole thing. One assessment that the people used to do in general, like say functional movement, might not be enough anymore, because now you're looking to see 8 different directions for that body to move, back, front, left, right, forward, right. So there's a lot of different things you have to see. So the way that we do things with the assessment is we are able to see everything from different, more objective and more scientific point of view. That is a la par with the evolution of the sports. In all sports.
And another thing that's really interesting too, Bram, on to that point, is that you're saying athletes are becoming a little bit more, there's not so much defined body types for positions any longer. We're seeing a lot in the NFL, guys like Saquon Barkley, who are absolute,
William,
who are absolutely massive, and they're playing running back, and they're running 40 times quicker than many wide receivers. We see it in the NBA too. You got guys like Anthony Davis and Kevin Durant prior to his injury, who are handling the ball like point guards, but they're also near 7 feet tall and able to, with a few steps, get to the rim and dunk. So as far as injury prevention is concerned, as far as performance is concerned, you have to figure the ligaments on these people are still the same. It's just that their bones are much longer, their muscles are much stronger. These are people that need to now take a much more concerted approach to their recovery and their load management. It's a very hot button issue right now in the industry, the load management across the NBA, and we're seeing it come up in the NFL too. But realistically, these are people who are putting forces in their body like never before, and they're exposed to forces like never before. And if we want to prolong these athletes' career, we want to maximize their efficient time on the field or on the court, we're really going to have to take a targeted approach on how much load and how much stress we're putting into their bodies. So it's amazing how as advanced as the science gets, as advanced as the technology gets, it always brings us back to the basics. We need to optimize our sleep quality. We need to make sure we're taking in quality nutrients. We need to make sure we're hydrated, limiting our unnecessary stress, and making sure that the training is consistent with not just the sport, not just the activity, but also the individual and their needs.
Up next, let's continue that conversation, focusing in on one of the major storylines of the young NBA season, load management. This is the Future Sport Podcast. So let's take a minute here to thank our friends at 3Advance. These guys are ranked one of the nation's top app developers, but that's not all. They've helped grow a bunch of sports tech startups like Team Builder, T-Box Tour, and in-game fantasy, but they're also experts in user experience, cloud APIs, and artificial intelligence. So if you're looking for a dev partner to bring your future sport tech to life, look these guys up. Go to 3advance.com. They're the team to make it happen, and advance you will. That's the number 3advance.com, and tell them Future Sport sent you. Let me stay on the topic of load management for a minute here, because it's a big deal, specifically in the NBA, because there are a lot of questions about what a player is supposed to do for the sake of the league, marketing, fans who buy tickets, gambling, fantasy, all these aspects that fall into this idea of a guy might not play 82 games and it won't be directly injury related. What is different now from the athletes from 20 years ago who typically did play 82 games before the playoffs began?
Right. So this is a great topic, and it's a perfect topic right now because Juan and I actually respectfully disagree on this. So we can play devil's advocate with each other on this one, and I'll give my perspective from the athletic trainer standpoint, and then I'll let Juan take over on the second end of things. So first of all, I think there's tremendous compelling arguments on both sides. Really, I totally understand where the TV companies are coming from, where the cable networks are coming from, obviously ticket sales and the business end of things, I completely understand. The important thing I think the important message to get across that the sports medicine industry and a lot of these medical staffs really aren't effectively communicating is that the goal of load management is not to necessarily limit the time that the player is on the court. The goal is actually to maximize the amount of time the player is on the court. So when you take, for example, a guy like Joel Embiid, who has a history of degenerative knee issues, guy is, a 7-foot, 200-plus pound specimen of nature that really has not existed, 20, 30 years ago in the NBA. This is someone who is playing through pain all the time, and when that medical staff sits down and they look at, his history of injuries, they're watching him, they're evaluating him on the court, they're evaluating him in the clinic. This is a collective effort between the doctors, the strength and conditioning team, the physical therapists, and the athletic trainers to say, okay, this is the appropriate amount of minutes given the research that we have, given the literature that we have, and the evaluations that we've done. This is the appropriate amount of time that we think is going to be safe and effective for him. So if he has to sit for a period of time in order to ensure that he's going to be close to 100% for the playoffs, in the case of a team that is poised to make the playoffs, then it's a necessary sacrifice in order to get them to that point. So if it's someone like Kawhi Leonard, who has, again, a history of kind of mysterious knee and quad injuries that have been a little bit debated in the past. This is someone who we're going to sit down and we're going to say on a not only a weekly basis but a daily basis, okay, Kawhi, how are you feeling? And he may be the type to say, I'm good. A lot of times you have athletes who are a little bit apprehensive to disclose fully how they're feeling to the staff because they're afraid of being perceived that they don't have that Kobe Bryant Mamba mentality or that Michael Jordan killer instinct. But the reality is Kobe Bryant's injury was cut short due to injury. And if we are able to maximize the amount of time that these players are playing, if we're able to ensure that they're going to make it through the playoffs, and if we're able to extend their careers, 2, maybe 3 seasons of actual effective play rather than being on and off the injured list, then I'm in favor of it. But I definitely think there's a strong argument to be had with figuring out when are the nationally televised games, when are the games that are going to be the highest draws for ticket sales. But I'll let Juan take over on playing devil's advocate with this argument.
Oh, you make it very easy for me now. So, no, I do agree with Sean what he's saying in terms of, like, we have 7 feet tall guys, 260 pounds, or 6'7", 285 pounds in the case of Zion, for example, not to name names, but they're not the same as our 90s Knicks, for example, or the 90s NBA, where you had the big, bulky, plowing centers. They didn't have to move a lot. They didn't have to jump that high. Just clog the lane, and that's it. Now you have a Porzingis, who's a 7'3" guy, 244 pounds, who needs to be in load management because of his knee injury, and he had a knee injury in the first place because there was a biomechanical issue with him. So my theory on that and my take on load management is the load management, yes, you can do it on the game, but in my opinion, it should be done during practices. It should be done when they're not playing. It should be putting more emphasis on the nutrition they have. It should be doing more emphasis on doing assessments and see if they're having a problem, a situation, and then based on that, do the load management. Nowadays, I see newspapers, I see on the news that after 5-4 games, they're not in NBA shape and they have to waste or have to lose another 4 or 5 games because they can't keep their shape. Why? It's a matter of culture as well. The eating habits are not there, and sleeping habits are not there. And whose fault is that? That probably would be on the training team. Not the training team, but the whole thing behind the team. What we have to do us as trainers is, like Sean is saying, at a daily basis, being with them, talking to them, see how they're doing in terms of their feeding habits, of how much they're sleeping properly, how much hydration they have, all those little things that sometimes some teams don't pay attention to. They just want them to run faster. They just want to be on the field. They just want to be as usable as possible. But it has to be more than that, in my opinion. There's a lot of non-monitoring their readiness. If they're ready to train that day, are they fatigued? Why are they fatigued? Did they eat well? Did they sleep well the day before? So I think load management, it has to be more than just don't let them play a game or see some game. It has to be more than, okay, maybe why don't we lose one practice? You know what? Kawhi, don't practice today, but I want you to be on the film room so you can see what you were doing right or not. These guys have been playing for years basketball. They know how to play basketball. They know how to do the plays. If we can control the load management via the practices or before the games with readiness, with nutrition, with sleep, whatever it is, I think that's much, much better. Because I agree with Sean. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money in the industry, both for the players, for the teams, for the owners, for the people that are betting on it, for the people that are watching TV on it, watching the games. So there's a lot of things that are happening. So if you don't have that game, or you don't go to that game, there's the only game that let's say the Mavericks coming on Thursday to play the Knicks, even though Sean and I, we despair on teams because I'm a Nets fan. And it's the only time you're going to be able to see that athlete. And he doesn't play because he's on load management. Isn't that disappointing for the fans?
There's so many financial aspects to this, though. I mean, Broadway actors have to take nights off, too, because they have rigorous schedules. But when they do it, it's explained to the audience and why they did it. And that industry seems to understand that you have this responsibility to be part of the event. So I think the NBA has to get their hands around this and find a happy medium. So let me bring up 2 parts that I hear from players. And one was from LeBron James, who said youth players are overtaxed, specifically by AAU hoops. Are you seeing that?
Yeah, for sure, Bram, and this is not just specific to basketball. We're seeing a lot, especially in baseball these days too, where with the rising cost of college tuition, there's been a much greater emphasis from parents on their children to excel in a single sport, and that's had a few different effects that have actually, began well-intentioned but have had detrimental outcomes. And the first is it's led to early sports specificity. So we have young athletes. At one time, it wasn't uncommon in high school to be a 3-sport athlete. You had a sport in the fall, you had a sport in the winter, you had a sport in the spring. And by playing 3 different sports, especially as your body's developing, you're developing a well-rounded nervous system. You have a body that is capable of, again, playing in 3 planes of motion, doing variable tasks, and developing to not only jump but also run, sprint, cut, move in different directions. You had a well-nourished body in terms of movement. Now what we're having is, if I'm playing basketball, like you said, basketball season ends, what do? I'm going to my AAU season. Oh, I have showcases all summer. I'm traveling all over the country for different tryouts, different showcases and events. And when you're playing one sport all year round, especially as your body's developing and as you're growing, you're much more likely to develop those overuse conditions that typically you don't see until later on in life. So now we have these young players coming up with overuse conditions that typically aren't presented until you're older or later on in life. And then people who don't understand this end of things are saying, oh, well, why is a 24-year-old being load managed? It's because this person, even though they may be 24 years in age, their bodies are already degenerated to the point where they're in their 30s or 40s. So if there was one answer to this, it would be, you want athletes playing as many sports as possible. You want them being multi-sport athletes until at least 17, 18. That's when there's really that point of diminishing returns, because the body's developed. I think it was 80% of the athletes drafted in the 2018 NFL draft were multi-sport athletes in high school. So we know that this makes you a better athlete. There's literature to support that they're less likely to get injured. And overall, I think it helps maintain the love and the joy for the game. I know Juan can definitely speak to this too, but I've seen a lot of young athletes who are already looking at their sport like it's a job. And it's unfair, but it's a reality of higher education in this country at this point, and it's going to take a major change in the thought process and the ethos going forward. But there are a lot of factors here at play that are causing athletes to kind of burn out prematurely.
And just to add to that, for example, I agree with him. There's a lot of kids, they're playing 5-6 games a day, and when you're just playing one sport, just like Sean is mentioning, your brain learns and only does certain biomechanics adjustments, right? So if you're just doing one sport, your brain's going to be used to just do certain movements. When you're doing different sports, there are different biomechanics. Your brain's going to be, okay, I can move forward, I can move backwards, I can move in different planes. I'm good with that. But when you're overdoing it with just one biomechanic aspect, you get overused situations. Now, another thing with the AAU, and I agree with what LeBron is saying, what people don't understand or don't see is you see kids at 16 years old with ACLs already. Why? Because they're being not just overused, but they're being, how do you say that, Sean? They're being already in context. They have in their minds that they have to jump higher, that their careers depend on how high they jump. Well, but they don't even tell them how they're landing either. And
I'm glad you, perfect segue. We had, our initial conversation was the bigger, stronger, faster. What we've seen in addition to the early sports specialization is that young athletes and the parents of the young athletes want their children to be trained the same way that LeBron James is training or the same way that Kawhi Leonard is training. But what they don't see is the years of foundational and prerequisite work that went into that. So if a young athlete who doesn't even have the ability to land with proper mechanics wants to start doing heavy plyometric training or sprint training or really heavy loaded up squats and deadlifts, it's like we need to take a step back here and work on your foundations first. So you wouldn't be taking advanced algebra before you take basic geometry. So a lot of times we kind of put the carriage before the horse, and the parents want the fancy, explosive training programs, but in reality what the child needs is some prerequisites and some general, some foundations first. So what we've seen is a lot of coaches, a lot of trainers and therapists for a while kind of pivoted to this. They gave in for the sake of making money. It was, okay, we'll give you sports specificity. You know, we'll train your 15-year-old to be stronger, faster, more explosive. But what happened was a lot of these athletes built up the acceleration without building up the brakes. So they've got Ferrari engines with Toyota Camry brake systems, and when they go to land or they go to change directions or they go to rapidly decelerate, that's when we're seeing these ligaments give out because the muscles don't have that eccentric to concentric balance, or they're extremely built up only in one specific plane of motion. So early sports specificity, overuse conditions, and training for explosiveness and training for power before we have the basic foundational movements, the foundational abilities, are all contributing to an absolute epidemic of early injuries in our youth population today.
All right, well, let me ask you this. For the NBA guys, let's say the league got rid of back-to-back games. Would that make a difference?
I think that would definitely be a good start. I'm not sure how feasible it is with an 82 games and the amount of travel that they have. I think that's definitely a good start, but at the end of the day, we're still guessing at this point, right? I think as the industry evolves, one thing that we've started integrating in our programming is daily readiness testing, and we've had a lot of success with it with our satellite programs at various schools and athletic programs. So one thing that we do is we are assessing the resting heart rate of the athlete in addition to a few different strength and performance metrics, one of them being the force plate analysis. So we have established a baseline with this athlete in the off season as to what their consistent resting heart rate is. We know what their general numbers are when they're well rested in terms of force production, in terms of left-right ratio with their legs, and in terms of how well they load and explode. And if we notice that there's a significant drop-off or there's a deficit in one of these factors, then we're saying, okay, how did you sleep last night? Like Juan was saying, how did you eat? Did you go out and party last night? You know, are you stressed? Are you fighting with your significant other? So there are external factors that can affect someone's their readiness to perform or their body's ability to perform that are completely separate from whether or not they played 2 games in a row or they had a rough travel week. So I think as our wearable technologies advance, I think as our assessment measures advance and as the technology grows, we're going to get a much more scientific approach to determining when someone needs to be load managed, when someone needs to be rested. But I think we're still a few years off from really having the literature support that.
So when they're traveling back-to-back, a good idea would be if they do back-to-backs, and it has to be against a team that is not as far. Because there's another aspect when they're traveling, the pressure applied in the cabins and the airplanes, that's going to be affecting your performance as well. Because you're not going to be able to sleep properly, you're not going to be able to work properly. The circulation is going to change when that pressure changes. You're going to be able to dehydrate over there as well. So it's a lot of different aspects. Not just going into a bus and going on a plane and let's go next door or the next game. That's not how it is. Those factors affect a lot the way that the athlete is going to be performing. Even if they don't feel it. It's like, oh, I'm good. Or like I was listening to, like, I'm 19 years old. I can take it. Yes, but that doesn't mean it's not affecting your performance.
Let's go back to the original question. What is different between Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Isaiah Thomas, the greats of their time to now? Because maybe they did miss some games, but it felt like they did so where there was a literal injury that you could point to. So what is the difference between the stars of then to the stars of today?
The demands of the game. The demands of the game. I mean, like I said, and let's put it this way. Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, they were playing against guys that didn't have to run a lot. For example, in Magic Johnson's team, you had James Worthy, you have Aaron Scott, right? And you have Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who didn't run a lot. He was basically just shooting, defending. So the dynamics were different. Now you have 7 feet tall guys running the floor at top speed, so they need to be more agile. They need to have more, the demands are bigger for them, so their bodies have to respond in a different way. LeBron James is a 60 pounds, 6'8" guy who runs like a point guard. Name me one player like that in the 90s and the 80s.
Yeah.
Besides Anthony Mason. See, the sport changed. It became faster. It became more of a shooting, became more of athletic. If you're not athletic, you can't play, or you're not going to be as useful as you would be. Back in the days, even if you weren't jumping, it didn't matter. As long as you be able to clog the lane, get for a rebound, and that's it.
And it's also important to remember, too, we have a psychological bias toward the athletes that were successful, but let's say that these measures were being taken in the 90s and 80s to preserve certain athletes. How many potential great athletes did we potentially miss out on because of injuries and because of avoidable overuse conditions? So, guys like Larry Bird, Michael Jordan, Patrick Ewing, they flourished in their times, but there could have been, and there likely were, many athletes whose careers were cut short because they were not load managed appropriately, they were not rehabbed appropriately, and they didn't take those recovery measures. And also, too, who's not to say that their careers could not have also been prolonged or potentially even enhanced had they not taken those measures. So, we can point to certain edge cases where people were successful and they did have longevity, but I would be really interested to look into the data and see how many people's injuries or how many people's careers were cut short because of injuries that could have potentially been avoided or mitigated.
For example, Bernard King, just to name one, he was a great athlete during that time, and what happened to him? He got injured. His knee blew up, and he wasn't the same.
There's about like 15 other topics I wanted to talk to you guys about, but this is a huge thing in the news, so I'd like to catch up with you guys again soon.
Certainly, anytime you want.
Great. Juan Delgado and Sean Kuechenmeister of the New York Sports Science Lab. Thank you both.
Thank you. Always. Thank you very much.
That will do it for us this week. As always, the future is now. This is the Future Sport Podcast. I'm Bram Weinstein. The Future Sport Podcast is brought to you by 3Advance, developers of sports tech apps that are AI-powered and UX-focused. So if you're looking to create some apps for your startup or your sports biz calls for some artificial or business intelligence, you should check out 3Advance. They're incredible. Go to 3advance.com. That's the number 3advance.com.